My name is Jonathan, and I'm the Chief Executive of the Free Speech Union. At the Free Speech Union, we firmly believe in the value and importance of debate, where truth is found through openly weighing and testing ideas. Yet New Zealanders feel more and more unable to have this debate, or hear competing opinions in an increasingly segregated intellectual environments. What we see now are proponents on one side and proponents on the other, and far too often neither shall the two meet. Polling which we recently conducted showed that 75% of 75% of Kiwis believe free speech is a defining cultural value. Yet a majority of Kiwis also believe that this very free speech is under attack. Decades ago, Lady Bird Johnson claimed that the clash of ideas is the very sound of freedom, and we still believe that to be true today. This may come across as an uncontroversial claim to make, certainly at a university. Yet according to the 2023 Academic Freedom Survey that we released, the Free Speech Union surveyed academics from around the country, and only 46% of academics agreed that they were free to question received wisdom and state unpopular opinions. If those who have dedicated their careers to exploring specific subjects feel unfree to voice their views if they are unpopular or controversial, how can these conversations move forward? It seems only too clear to us that popular and uncontroversial perspectives are not going to cut it. That's why, inspired by other events such as the Monk Debates, the Free Speech Union has organised a 4-part series over 6 weeks, where the principle of free speech can be practised through the exchange of differing thoughts and perspectives. Tonight, you are not just invited into a passive experience. You get to have your say too. So before I hand over to our moderator for this evening, who will introduce our guests, you see above me on our screens and on your television a QR code. If you scan that code with your camera setting, you'll be prompted to follow a link where you can participate in tonight's polling, where you can see the moots that you agree or disagree that our tax system is unfair and the rich should pay more, and whether you are willing to change your mind. At the end of tonight's event, after the debate, you'll be prompted to conduct this polling again, and those not those who have the most popular support, but those who have convinced the most in the audience will be declared the winners for tonight. Now, I'll hand over to Sean Plunket, the founding editor of the platform. I understand they call him El Duce there, and he's going to lead us for tonight. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. Thank you for the invitation to be here tonight. The Free Speech Union, I think, is an important organisation that promotes and attempts to uphold vital principles in our democracy. Principles which are sometimes questioned and under threat. So thank you very much for the opportunity to be here tonight. It is a debate, so it might get a bit bumpy. Could I ask that any members of Vision New Zealand or Freedom New Zealand who are in the audience to not disrupt us? Thank you. And I don't see anyone who fits the bill, to be honest. You also don't look like a bunch of social media influencers, if I'm going to be frank. The way we run, we have 5 minutes opening statements from each of our speakers, a 2.5-minute rebuttal from each of our speakers, then some general questions, and I'm going to actually ask you guys to come up with some questions when we come to that section, and then a wrapping up. What are the rules? Well, I'm going to make them up as we go along. Because I think that's more fun and we want to enjoy free speech tonight. I think we've got 2 great teams and I want to introduce them very, very briefly because we want to get into it. Daniel Mclauchlan says he's a writer. He does stuff that I do not understand because I don't have a university degree. You work most of the time at Vic, Daniel?
That's right, yeah.
That's right. Daniel writes some good stuff, and I've read a fair bit of it. I don't agree with all of it, but it is thought-provoking and it is well written. So, Daniel, on the other side, I guess we've got a team of evil Nazi lobbyists from think tanks. Not really. I've known Jordan Williams a long time. Jordan is from the Taxpayers Union, funniest bloody union I've ever seen. Jordan is a trained lawyer. and someone involved in lobbying, advocacy, and he's also, he pops up on the platform occasionally. Nice to have you with us this evening, Jordan. Max Rashbrooke is a guy who can write, I think, very directly, Max, your columns. Once again, don't always agree with them, don't always agree with Jordan, but well written and pointed and on point, which is what good journalism does. Max also, what do you sit in here? What faculty are you part of here, Max?
The School of Government.
School of Government. So, Max, I suppose two academics here. Welcome to you, Max. And finally, a guy's been on the platform a bit in the last couple of weeks, Eric Crampton from the New Zealand Initiative, which the lefties say is like the morph of the Business Round Table, but more acceptable. And Eric, too, is someone who writes studies. He's had a fascinating trip recently to Ireland to look at their economy and how it operates, and also someone I often seek clarification or advice on in terms of emission trading and the economics of emission trading. Eric is by trade an economist. So there are our two teams. And I think they are both teams very capable of sparring and jarring with each other with no one getting hurt, and to have a real contest of ideas. I'm going to start now with 5 minutes, and I have no bell. I'm just going to go bing, bing, okay, in the absence of a bell. So we're going to start with the 5 minutes, and our moot is, remember, the tax system is unfair, and the wealthy, or the rich. Now, can we just clarify, is it wealthy or rich? Because someone's going to have an argument over that. What have you got?
It says wealthy on my...
Wealthy? What have you got? Wealthy? Wealthy?
Yeah.
Wealthy. Okay, the wealthy must pay more. And I would have said 6 weeks ago, this isn't going to be an issue for the election campaign. It shows you how much I know. Tax most certainly is, policy-wise, front and centre on the hustings for the 2023 election. So, to kick it off, arguing in the affirmative that the tax system is unfair and the wealthy must pay more, 5 minutes to Daniel Mclauchlan. Oh, no, hang on, what have I got here? Max, you kick off. Max Rashbrooke.
Well, thanks very much for that introduction, Sean. Thank you, everyone, for being here. And thanks, of course, to Eric and to Jordan. It's great to be here at this debate, and it's particularly pertinent for me because I've just come from my monthly volunteering stint at the Soup Kitchen on Tory Street, where I help serve some of the city's most vulnerable residents. And although that service is provided by a charity, the people running it are quite explicit that they're picking up the pieces left by underfunded public social services. And I agree with that. I'm very happy to volunteer there, but I think the fact that I do so is a sign of a much wider state failure. I'd much rather live in a world where there was more adequate social housing, for instance, so that fewer people turn up at the Soup Kitchen homeless and in need of help. I'd like there to be more generous state support for those guests who have disabilities or are suffering mental health problems and life crises. I'd like to see greater fundings for programs like the Healthy Homes Initiative, which provides curtains, heating and insulation for poorer families, and which for a few $1 million a year helps reduce hospital admissions from the people it serves by 20%. State-funded programs like these are a reminder that, as the American jurist Oliver Wendell Holmes once said, taxes are how we pay for civilization. But who's paying for that civilization? Is the structure of the tax system fair? Are we asking enough of our best-off citizens? I would argue that we're not, in two key ways. Firstly, we can look at how much New Zealand asks of its well-off citizens compared to how much similar countries ask of theirs. And according to OECD research published just a week ago, a New Zealander on 5 times the average wage pays just 13% of their income in tax, in part because so much of it is typically in capital gains. In Australia, the equivalent person pays nearly 30%. So that's 13 versus 30%. In the UK and the US, the figure is 28%, so twice what the equivalent New Zealander is paying. And that's not even to mention the 35% of their income that the well-off Dutch or German person pays, or the 44% paid by their Danish equivalent. In short, according to the OECD, a neutral authoritative body, New Zealand asks very little of its wealthiest citizens when it comes to paying tax. And we can also look at this question just within New Zealand. The negative camp may well argue that the richest 10% pay a large proportion of the total tax take. But to the extent that that's true, it's only because those people take a very large share of the income in the first place. And so that is ironically a statistic that supports our argument that things are fundamentally unfair. And in any case, the far more important statistic, I think the essential one for judging the fairness of the tax system, is what proportion of their own income people pay in tax. And in New Zealand, we ask a lot of our poorest citizens on that score. They pay GST in a far more comprehensive way than is true in comparable countries, and they pay tax on every dollar of their income. Whereas in other countries, Britain and Australia, for instance, the first $10,000 or $20,000 of income would be tax-free. Middle New Zealanders, meanwhile, pay around 20% of their income in tax. In contrast, according to recently published inland revenue research, which you may have seen some coverage of, the very wealthiest New Zealanders pay less than 10% of their income in tax. The negative camp, I'm hearing something from over there, I anticipate might say something like, well, these calculations were flawed because their definition of income included unrealised capital gains. In other words, increases in the values of assets that haven't yet been sold. But that just reflects the fact that the research only covered a 6-year period, so measuring only actual sales that occurred during that time would have missed much of the gains. If the inland revenue had been able to look over a longer time period, most of those increases in paper values would have been cashed out. In short, the income measured in that report is real, and it remains true that the wealthiest New Zealanders pay a lower tax rate than people stacking shelves in supermarkets at half the tax rate that we ordinary New Zealanders pay. So it seems clear to me that looking at both our inland revenue research and the OECD research that I mentioned earlier, the tax system is profoundly unfair, and we might reasonably ask for a greater contribution to our collective success as a nation from our best off citizens. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Max, and you'll get your chance, Jordan, don't worry. All right, to negate the moot, we'll now hear from Eric Crampton.
Thank you so much, Sean, and thank you for all turning out. I'm sorry that you're not getting Ruth Richardson instead of me. I'm a clearly inferior alternative. There's an awful lot packed into today's moot, that the tax system is unfair and that the wealthy must pay more. But it's important to stay on point. A tax system is fair to the extent that it treats individuals in equivalent circumstances equally, that it is predictable rather than arbitrary in application, that one's proportionate share of the burden of providing public goods reflects one's proportionate share of the benefits enjoyed thereof. And for government spending that is not on public goods, that the beneficiaries of that spending, wherever possible, are called on to fund that expenditure, the beneficiary principle. These principles are reasonably agreed. They apply equally well for drawing the revenue necessary to fund a minimalist government or an expansive one. However big a government you want, these are the principles for tax that should underlie them. You can find the roots of them going back at least to Adam Smith, and you can find them in modern public finance textbooks today. Today's moot doesn't ask us to judge how large the state should be. It does not ask us to judge which parts of life's unfairness, and there are many, should draw government programs or income support. Unfortunately, neither does it ask us about the unfairness created by the state when governments make it impossible to build more homes, to enter markets that are protected for the benefit of incumbents, or when ministers' families seem surprisingly adept at drawing lucrative government contracts at our expense. If the moot asks whether there is any unfairness in the tax system, no tax system could pass that test. Smokers and moderate drinkers pay far more in tax than they ever cost the health system. Everyone else pays slightly less in tax because of it. That's unfair. Failure to inflation index the income tax thresholds means that increasing numbers of lower income earners pay higher rates of tax. That too is unfair. Nevertheless, work presented by Treasury in February showed that as of 2019 data, the net fiscal impact of the tax and transfer system was no worse for the bottom two deciles than it was in 2010, so no increasing unfairness, and that was when the tax thresholds were last set. On that same analysis, Only the top 3 income deciles pay net tax at all. 70% of households receive more in transfers and services than they pay in tax. The 39% rate imposed since then will mean even more of the burden falls on those on higher earnings. And tax issues facing migrants arriving in New Zealand with an overseas pension are Byzantine at best. But this moot cannot have asked only whether the tax system is unfair to any trivial degree, as that would make for an uninteresting debate. I don't think there's anybody here who'd disagree with it. We could all agree, we'd go home, and it'd be boring. The moot instead would have to propose more than some de minimis unfairness, and that the unfairness could usefully be rectified by calling on the wealthy to pay more, effectively Revenue Minister David Parker's tax proposition or the Greens' wealth tax. This side is happy to stand in the negative against that moot. My partner Jordan will argue that Minister Parker's proposition, the real underlying moot, violates norms of fairness, that the Prime Minister was correct to pull the plug last minute on comprehensive plans that had been developed to impose a wealth tax, and that had that plug not been pulled, another plug would have been pulled instead, with the economy flowing down the drain as capital fled. I will stand against it by arguing a better moot. The tax system is unfair, and everyone should pay less tax.
Hear, hear.
I do this by advancing one further proposition. If the government cannot demonstrate real value from the taxes that it collects from us, it cannot justify even current levels of taxation, let alone propose higher taxes on anyone. Our moot is not about the size of government. If taxes were raised fairly and government delivered value for that money and could demonstrate that it could deliver even more value if it had even more money, that would be one thing. It would have to further demonstrate that putting a greater proportion of that burden on the wealthier would be the most effective. But that maybe today's moot could be defended on a land value tax in that kind of a world. But that's not the state of the world we're in. Core Crown expenditures for 2023 were estimated at 32.5% of GDP. Relative to what the Labour government proposed in 2019, it's an absolute increase in spending of about $7,800 per household. Okay? And what have we got for it? A Jobs for Nature program designed as a make-work scheme when economic calamity was predicted, but the government stuck with it at a cost of over $1 billion. Administrative restructuring programs for the health system and the polytechs that have cost billions of dollars. And I'm just about out of time. Hundreds of millions on industrial subsidies. An unusable subsidy for video game makers, right? This is what we're getting for it. Well, it's utterly small potatoes, but the complete contempt that Wellington officials demonstrate for taxpayers in throwing lavish welcome parties for incoming chief executives and for incoming DCEs, like, come on, what is going to happen if we give them more money? P.G. O'Rourke used to say that giving money and power to government is like giving whiskey and car keys to teenage boys. Supporters of this debate's moot might figure it's fair to tax the wealthy to fund more of that kind of drunken spree. I think it's reckless. Until the drivers sobered up, we ought instead to be talking about taking away the keys. The tax system is unfair. Everyone, wealthy or not, should be paying less.
Hear, hear. Hear, hear.
I think the battle lines are getting quite well drawn. So into the fray, Daniel.
So for a few years during the housing bubble, which sounds like it's going to come back next year, my house earned more money than I did. The gains on the house were higher than my salary, which is not very high, but it's high enough to be in one of those bands that Eric talked about where I'm actually a net taxpayer, and I'm going to talk about that a bit later on. But I couldn't help noticing that I had to get up and go to work to earn my income, which was then taxed. And my house just kind of sat there and gained value and paid no tax. And I've read enough taxpayer union press releases to know that Jordan will be thinking, Daniel is indulging in the politics of hate here.
No.
Daniel is coming from a place of envy. Daniel is jealous of his house because it's entrepreneurial and wealth creating. It's dynamic, it's innovating, it's generating export revenue, it's creating jobs. And I am actually kind of jealous of the house. It seems like the more it earns, the more attention my wife pays to the house instead of me, sort of sanding the floorboards and glazing the windows. But I would say it's not an entrepreneur or an innovator because it's just a house. It's not sentient. And the reason it is gaining value is because the property market is broken. It's just deliberately broken. We have artificial scarcity in that market. So, it gains in value without any wealth being created. And, the building materials market is a cartel. So it's not creating value, it's extracting value, it's parasitic. It is still close to shops and buses, so it kind of balances out, but it's still not a wealth-creating entity. And when we talk about taxing the rich, the wealthy, is the moot, we make this assumption that the wealthy are a homogenous group, that they're making their money the same way, and that they're being taxed the same way, and that if we change the burden of the tax system, then it's going to affect them all the same way. And I move that this is a false assumption, that we already tax the productive rich. We tax them very, very heavily. That's one thing that comes out of David Parker's wealth report, and that's the point that has been made, that a lot of the income revenue comes from high-income earners. But we don't really tax the unproductive rich, which are, like my house, they really just sit there at all. That income is tax-free. And so we have optimized our economy for that kind of economic gain. If it's really an entrepreneurial economy, then we have to ask ourselves, where are the incredible high-wage jobs that it's generating? And where are the export revenues? Our terms of trade are terrible. We're hemorrhaging skilled workers to Australia, and we have no productivity gains from these businesses. And that's because when IRD looks at those businesses, it says that the majority of the gains are going to what it calls land-rich entities. And some of that is land as commercial property, and some of it is farmland, but basically it's houses. That's what the wealthy in our country have optimized for, because they would be crazy not to, because that is the structure that the tax system points them in. And I'm thinking Eric here is thinking, well, Daniel, you're just so deranged by envy and hatred. The problem here
I largely agree.
The problem here is that there is regulation in the property market. It's not the tax system. And I would point out that it is the parties of the right that are preventing the property market from being deregulated. It's ACT that fought the strongest fight against the minimum density reform.
Shame.
Yeah. But I would also say that our tax system explicitly distorts the market. Nearly every other country in the OECD has what they call a broad-based, low-rate approach to taxation. You don't want to be distorting the market. You don't want to be telling people how they should be making their economic income. Using the tax system to do that is going to shift people in different directions, exactly as it has done in New Zealand. And so we have this market that is dominated by passive capital gains, and because that is untaxed, it keeps eating more of our income through the bracket shift. And exactly as most economists would have predicted, it's turned us into a massive housing market that just ships milk solids to China as a kind of side gig. And we might not be doing that for very long. So should we tax the rich? I think some of our rich should be paying less tax. I think I should be paying a lot less tax. You can pay more if you want. But I think we should tax the rich that have optimized for passive capital gains, partly because it's fair, partly because we can, maybe pay for dental or other, extravagances like that, but mostly because our current model is just completely broken. We've followed it for 40 years with very mediocre results, and we will continue to destroy our productive economy if we do not.
Thank you, Daniel. All right. Buckle up. Here's Jordan Williams.
I'd love to respond to some of that straight away, but I first need to start with a little bit of an apology. Being in the Free Speech Union has many amazing qualities. Apparently setting a good moot is not one of them, because I would argue, like my colleague, that the tax system is indeed unfair, but for the opposite direction than our opponents would have you believe. So I'm going to reframe the moot. In short, they want higher taxes. This side of the House wants lower taxes. So to argue that, this team have to convince you, my opponents must convince you, that the money you are currently giving to the government is being well spent. And friends, I put to you, you do not need to read very many taxpayer union press releases to realise that right now, despite the 40-odd% increase in government spending in the last 3 years, we've got a health system teetering on collapse, our education standards are falling through the floor, law and order is a mess, and indeed, the homelessness problem has got significantly worse. And it's a point I want to come back to in relation to something that I consider a tax, and indeed, my friend Daniel has not read enough Taxpayers Union press releases to realise that in fact we stand on the side of deregulation, of housing restraints and regulatory taxes. There, do not put us in the same category as the right-wing parties you referred to. The thing is, we haven't yet had it raised, but no doubt in debates like this, Scandinavia is brought up. And okay, we put aside the fact that the Scandi countries, when you put aside the oil, tend to be less productive and actually slightly poorer overall than the friends in mainland Europe. But I ask my friends here, do you want your private ambulances services competing for you? Do you want the charter schools and effectively school vouchers? Because there's something I've learned from spending time in Norway with Eric's colleagues and recently in Finland at the wonderful Taxpayers Union of Finland, wonderful organisation, is that the public expect very good services for the high tax burden they have. So I come back to the other team must convince you that to give the government more money, they are not wasting what they already have. And friends, I say they fail on that. The second key point is it's not enough to say a moral argument around certain people or pointing to a group saying they don't pay enough. Because even if you agree for that, if it makes us all poorer, is that a worthwhile trade-off? Because clearly, if you tax us up to the wazoo, New Zealand becomes poorer. And that is why, this concept of the Laffer curve, if we have a 0% tax rate, we do not have the money for the good quality core public services that we would all agree are necessary in a free society. But similarly, if you have a tax rate at 99% or 100%, your revenue is also zero. This is the concept of a Laffer curve. And the sort of taxes my friends on the opposing team are talking about are the very worst in terms of making us poorer. It was rightly pointed out that New Zealand's economic performance is underachieving, we have low wages, and the key problem, the economic problem, in my lifetime has been low wages because New Zealand is undercapitalised. We have a huge current account deficit. We rely on the savings from friends overseas. We put too much money in housing. For the regulatory impacts that the Taxpayers Union champion should be removed, and my friend Daniel supports those measures. But the solution being put up by those that argue the wealthy don't pay enough tax is that to tax the very thing we need, capital and investment, except in the case of many of those politicians proposing a wealth tax, except the family home. The very unproductive asset that my friend Daniel was talking about, for which we do not do better out of it. Capital is movable, and a wealth tax would make us poorer. Even if you don't accept that, I say to you, look at what Norway has just done around increasing its wealth tax. I think it was 0.1%. It was a tiny amount. The total tax revenue decreased because your richest, your brightest are leaving. Now in New Zealand,
Bing.
Bing. Thank you, Sean.
Okay, thank you. I'll just make the observation, there's a quote I've always remembered from Don Brash saying New Zealand has an unhealthy obsession with home ownership, and it seems to me both sides might be agreeing on that to some extent or the other. It is now time for rebuttal, and I think, as I said, the battle lines are pretty well drawn. So to kick off, and this is 2.5 minutes of rebuttal, we'll start with Max.
Well, thanks for that. I feel like our opponents have painted a very dark dystopian vision of what happens when you try to increase taxes on the wealthy, but sadly I don't think the facts bear it out. The most comprehensive study of tax cuts published by the London School of Economics a few years ago, looking at 50 years of history in 18 countries, found that cutting taxes has no significant increase on enhancing economic growth when you cut them on the wealthy, nor does it increase employment. It does very significantly boost the incomes of the wealthy, however. So that doesn't sound like a particularly great recipe for success. And, you know, I look at these countries, and actually I didn't bring up the Scandinavians because you don't need to. You can just look at Germany, the Netherlands, Austria, all countries with much higher tax takes than ours, all countries with taxes like much higher income taxes, inheritance taxes, capital gains taxes, and their economies over a very long period have outperformed ours. And that's partly because the investments that they make with that tax revenue enables them to lift people out of poverty. It ensures that fewer talents are squandered through poverty, because there is no greater thief of talent and promise than deprivation, and the whole economy and the society benefits from that. I mean, yes, there is probably, as Jordan said, a Laffer curve, where there is a sort of an optimal tax rate for getting the most revenue out of your wealthy. And work by Stephanie Stant-Shaver and Emmanuel Saez a few years ago suggested the optimal top tax rate for that purpose is somewhere between 50 and 80%. So I think we are well on the downside of the Laffer curve. On the point about the value of public spending, of course, look, we can all point to $40,000 farewell parties for chief executives, which I think are outrageous. And if I were in charge, I would certainly be going for greater efficiency in government by asking frontline public servants and the users of public services about how those services could be much better delivered. But the tens of millions or even the hundreds of millions of dollars you might save from that are not going to fund the billions of dollars we need to spend on dealing with the increased cyclones and floods and droughts that are coming away because of climate change. It's not going to fund you the money that you need to spend on retraining people who've spent a long time away from the labour market, policies that the Scandinavians, there they are, spend billions of dollars on and get people back into work much more quickly. It's not going to pay the billions of dollars that we need to make dental and other forms of healthcare free. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Max. Eric, 2.5 minutes.
Great.
Your response.
Thank you. Max noted underfunded state services. I wish that we were still in the world that we were in circa 2016, when I had a lot of hope that state services were just going to be on track for becoming more and more efficient and effective. We had mechanisms in place that were evaluating the effects of government spending on real people's lives, making sure that they were delivering value, introducing contestability into it so that if the state sector was not delivering that value, NGOs that could do it would be funded instead. I do not have that hope currently. If anything, all of those targets have been abandoned in favor of maintaining very established state sinecures in the state sector, partially for the benefit of the public sector union. It is antithetical to delivering good social services, and it is what we will get more of if we increase tax rates from where they are. Again, we are paying about $7,800 more per household than Labour was forecasting in 2019. It's about $14.5 billion. Yeah, the current cyclone, that's about $1 billion worth. Where's the other 13.5? Okay, so we've had about $1 billion on the health system restructure, and then again on the polytechs. Looks like the polytechs are going to fall apart as a consequence of it. It's not delivering real value. If we were in a world where it was delivering real value, this would be a different argument. We're not in that world right now, and it will only make things worse if we give them more money and reinforce bad practice. On the points around the income shares paid by the wealthy in other places, I'd noted the OECD tables showing that the average earner in France faces a 47% tax wedge, and in New Zealand it's 20%. So tax rates overall are higher elsewhere, not just on the wealthy. to the point that Daniel was making on housing, vehement agreement here, but you don't build more houses with a tax policy. You build more housing by liberalizing zoning and making sure that councils want to encourage more housing be built. Abolish the capital gains at source by making sure that a flood of housing can enter the market whenever there's profit in it. If more people want to move here, there's more demand for housing, we should have the exact same thing happen as happens in every other market. If people move here, they want to buy cars, we get more cars. People move here, they need haircuts, we get more barbers. It's only housing that's messed up because it's so tangled up in regulation. Freeing that up really matters. So vehement agreement with Daniel, but the solution isn't in tax. Tax has never built a house, and I'll end it there.
Thank you. And Dan, I was just wondering, is your wife home with your house tonight, or is she?
She's out drinking.
With the house. Yeah. Daniel, 2.5 minutes rebuttal, off you go.
Okay. So I was very fascinated. Eric, who I keep wanting to call Ruth, mentioned Adam Smith and Smith's principles of tax fairness and the other principles that should guide the structure of taxation in a free market economy. And I kind of feel like the taxation on income versus capital gains is just not fair. People that are in similar situations and making similar revenues just pay either quite high levels of taxes or no taxes. And that just seems to violate those principles in a way that seems quite obvious to me. And I also have found myself thinking about Smith quite a lot. It's an interesting book to go back and read, The Wealth of Nations, because the economic system he's critiquing, mercantilism, is a system in which, because the wealthy dominate the political process, they basically just design it to optimize for themselves and for that kind of rent-seeking that I was talking about earlier, because it's better to not have to work and just make money because you've rigged the market in your favor than it is to have to actually compete in a free market. And I always find that Smith's description of mercantilism is quite an accurate description of what we've built here in New Zealand. People who just don't want to pay tax and have the political will to impose that on the tax system just don't have to. And it's not fair, and it's not a free market system. It's a broken system. And it seems strange to me that people who affect to believe in competitive free markets advocate for this distorted system that is more or less the opposite of what they seem to believe in.
Okay, you've got another minute if you want.
I think I want to talk about wealth taxes versus capital gains, because this is a fascinating thing to me. I feel like Chris Hipkins kind of said the quiet part out loud when he was on the talk shows during the weekend, when he said, we didn't want a capital gains tax because you kind of pay all this political capital up front, and then it takes a long time before you start getting the revenue from it. So some other government will get that revenue after he's spent all that political capital. And that makes it very unappealing for a politician. And I feel like the Green Party and David Parker and Grant Robertson have figured that out. You pay the political capital and then you do the wealth tax and you just start grabbing the wealth yourself. So I think you're going to end up with one of those, and you need to really make a decision about which seems more palatable.
All right, thank you. Look, there are 100 different ways we can go with this. I've got 2 questions I want to ask, and the first one is a general... sorry, Jordan.
I did speak over last time.
Yeah.
The top 10% of income earners pay half. This team need to convince you that they should be paying 2/3 or 3/4.
They should be paying less. They should be paying less.
They should be paying less.
Yeah, and the people who pay no tax should be paying more. That's what we're saying.
The top 10% of income earners pay more than half. Around 70%.
They pay half the income tax. They pay none of.
Pay negative net tax. The question is, how much worse would you make it? We've had the response from Max.
Make it better.
Response from Max on my point about if the taxing the wealthy makes us all poorer, is it worth it? And he referred to the wonderful London School of Economics, but missed the point that it is not your total amount of tax you pay, it is the marginal rate that makes the difference in terms of incentives to invest and and work and educate yourself and move up the ladder. That is why the Taxpayers Union unusually does not actually support a no tax threshold, because it is your marginal rate that matters, and those countries with tax-free thresholds increases that marginal rate. Agree with all the points in relation to Adam Smith. Adam Smith, of course, was against power, the sort of power, regulatory power that the RMA creates. There is a distinction, though, in income earned from capital investment, in that you are putting that at risk.
But you're not in the New Zealand housing market.
And that is why countries around the world, our one was the most extreme one in the world, the Cullen proposal, but don't charge marginal rates on capital gains because it is inherently risky. And I come back to my point. New Zealand needs the entrepreneurship and risk-taking. New Zealand is starved of capital. We are our labour is less productive. Why would you tax that and indeed make the situation worse in terms of people parking money in housing? And very finally, I'm very glad Max didn't re-bring up the IRD report. There was a rude word mentioned under a breath, but of course that wasn't me, that was paraphrasing Treasury's own report that they released at the same time as IRD. I'm not aware of any other government report being so terrible other government agencies are refusing. Parker and Grant Robinson wanted a wealth tax. They were ruled out because it would make us all poorer. I go with this man's view. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. All right. We've got some questions coming through. Keep them coming, please. I want to start with just a very simple yes, no to all four of you. And it strikes me there is actually some ground of agreement here on some problems. Does anyone think we've got a good tax system now? Yes or no? Daniel?
No.
No? Max?
I don't think it's black and white, but if you had to push me towards one or the other, I'd say no.
No. Eric?
Compared to my ideal, no. Compared to the rest of the world, yes.
And Jordan?
I'd agree. Per dollar, for what it's raised, for what it costs, it's among the lowest in the world.
Okay, so you are this side more comfortable with the status quo than this side, though you were kind of vacillating a bit there, Max. The other fundamental question I think we need to ask, particularly at a time of heightened political activity, and it seems a very simple question, but it's one I don't think the person in the street or the person in the street might want to know from you guys. What is the purpose of a tax system? Is it to make the world fair? Is it just to fund the stuff the government does for the nation? What is the purpose, the fundamental purpose of a tax system, Jordan?
It's a necessary evil to fund an efficient state, in my view.
All right.
It's that which is necessary to pay for the wonderful things that government might be able to provide, at least minimal law and order, and then expanding through there into social insurance.
Okay.
It's the necessary price for those things. It's not a good in itself.
Okay, so it's a financial tool in all its different guises
to
deliver government
services,
fund government services. All right, Max, what is a tax system to you fundamentally?
It's got a bunch of different purposes, one of which is to nudge people's behaviour in certain different directions, so alcohol and cigarette taxes, for instance, the absence of taxes on land, for instance, nudge people into certain investments. But most fundamentally, I mean, tax funds what government does. And why does government come into existence? Because we face collective problems, because there are things that government, as Abraham Lincoln said, that we can't do for ourselves, or we can't do so well by ourselves in our individual and several capacities. So that's why the state comes into being, to deal with these big collective problems, to build collective infrastructure, and to support others who are struggling, and taxes is how we pay for that.
Right, but you also see this coercive nature of tax that can modify our behaviours.
Yeah, I mean, that's not a big part of it for me, but you just look at how taxes operate. It's clear that alcohol and cigarette taxes are used for that, for instance. That's just something that happens.
Haven't worked for me. Daniel, what is the purpose?
So,
the fundamentals of what a tax system is?
Well, revenue is a big part of it, but I think what is important for me, and is less important for Max, is that tax is a price that the government is setting on economic activity, and price is a signal wrapped in an incentive. And the signal and incentive that our government and our tax system sends is, if you want to make a profitable company and pay yourself dividends, we're going to tax that. Don't do that. If you're going to work for a living, well, we're going to tax that. If you're going to make a lot, we're going to tax that very heavily. And if you are just, rent seeking, that's completely untaxed. So do that. Optimize for that. Put your seed capital into that. That's where we've gone wrong.
And strangely enough, I feel when you say that, I see it. The people who have invested in the platform and have got that going would have made far more money. In fact, they would have made some money just by throwing it into real estate.
Yep.
And you need to find investors who are prepared to sacrifice the easy money to get entrepreneurship going or to generate entrepreneurship. All right. We've got an idea of how you see the tax system. I say you guys are a bit more hard-hearted or direct about it. There are some other social goods and needs in the tax system from this side of the room. Let's look at a specific tax policy and see if you can agree whether it's a good idea or not. This has come from the audience. Does anyone think removing the GST on fresh fruit and vegetables is a good idea? Max, I'm going to start with you.
No, I was arguing against that publicly months ago and haven't changed my mind.
Well,
Okay. Eric.
Obviously not. It's a terrible idea.
Okay. Daniel.
No.
No.
Of course not.
Okay. And Jordan.
bonkers.
Amazing then. How does this become a cornerstone policy if one of our major political parties fighting to retain the Treasury benches?
Well, they told us very clearly that it focus grouped well. That's what they briefed the press gallery. That's why we're
Isn't
doing
an election
Not
just a
among
big
tech
focus
hobbyists.
group, isn't it?
Sorry?
Well, I mean, Chris Hipkins is always talking about uniting the nation. And look, I mean, he united us in opposition to that terrible policy.
Can any of you explain just simply why it's such a dumb idea?
Because
I think you all agree.
the genius of our GST is we didn't fall into the mistake of having a little bit of carve-out, which means that it inherently grows. So for my sins, I go to international tax conferences, and I'm always accustomed that New Zealand's GST system is the best. Because we had to start it with fruit and vegetables, next it would be sanitary products, next it would be food. We'd have court cases in the UK, you go to a service station, you get a frozen pie, that's food, no VAT. You put it in the microwave, heat it up, it's a meal. There's VAT on that. You have court cases on whether it's like a mallow puff is a cake or a biscuit. Those are the sorts of things that we just don't have in New Zealand, and we are lucky for it.
And it gets worse than that, right? So if you look at other systems that raise a bit of money through GST, like Hungary has to have, I think it's a 28% GST to raise anywhere close to what we get out of our 15% GST because it's riddled with holes. New Zealand is able to raise an awful lot of revenue for the government at a very low tax rate. And the usual argument against it is that, well, poor people are hit by this. But you have to remember that you bundle a consumption tax like GST with an income tax, and you can achieve any level of progressivity you want, right? You put the two together as a system.
Do you guys disagree with anything they've said here?
Not really. I mean,
How come you don't have more influence to stop them doing that, man?
Yeah.
Surely, progressive thinkers, left-wing thinkers like you should have got hold of them and said, don't do that. That's crazy.
Nothing can compete with the power of the focus group. In my experience, we're all helpless.
All
for
right,
its
I
power.
think we've got an accord on GST off food. I want to ask about another tax that's been in the news. Tax on overseas people with Asian-sounding names probably, paying more for expensive properties they buy here. Do we think that's a good idea, and do we think we even know what sort of revenue it would generate? Eric?
Well, right now, I think Nicola Willis also made this point. A ban is an infinite tax, right? You say that you'd have to pay an infinite amount of money to be able to do the thing. It's a ban. You can't do it. Well, we're reducing the tax rate. They propose reducing that tax rate from infinity to 15%. And whether or not they buy themselves a few scraps in some international tax treaties, well, some of the experts have suggested it's not quite as bad of an issue as you might have expected. But really, you got to wonder where this is coming from. So Kiwis seem to think that everywhere else in the world puts these great big restrictions on foreigners buying stuff. If you want to buy a house in Portugal, they'll give you a residence visa because you've invested in Portugal, right? New Zealand has this really distorted view of what the restrictions are everywhere else in the world. It's true that a few places have started putting in foreign buyer taxes, but it's rare. Most places don't restrict against foreign buyers. They treat people equally. And New Zealand seems to have decided that foreigners are a bad thing and that their money is also a bad thing.
Are you fundamentally saying dumb idea?
Well, I'm saying that it'd be even better to get rid of the ban and encourage foreign investors to come in and build as many darn houses as they can.
That sounds like dumb idea.
It's better than the current dumb idea, but still not good.
Yeah, it's a dumb idea that is a symptom of what the underlying problem is, which is restrictions on supply. Just looking up at some of my staff because I'm not sure if the TU has taken a position on this, so I might be contrarian. But I'm just not as concerned as many about foreigners coming in and buying the one thing you can't move, which is land and houses.
All right. Does that tax, much debated, does that indicate that the National Party also has focus groups, Max?
Well, I wouldn't have thought so because I don't think that rightly or wrongly allowing foreigners to buy houses in New Zealand is particularly popular. I suspect that means more that they're desperately looking out for sources of revenue that they can lay their hands on because they don't think the kind of cuts they would like to make to public services are politically palatable. My own personal view, I mean, I don't really have strong views about it. I think the weakness against Labour's ban in the first place was that it was never clear that there were that many foreigners buying houses, but then that turns into a weakness for National, because if that's true, and that remains true, then they're not going to generate anything like $2.9 billion in revenue over 4 years from their policy, which seems a heroic assumption, to use a more polite term than Chamabil Jakub used on TV about it the other day. So I think they're going to struggle with that.
And Daniel, are you worried that your house is sitting there waiting for a nice person from Beijing to come along and sweep it off its feet?
It is right next to a large construction site, so they're welcome to it. If they can meet the $2 million threshold for the tax. But I guess that I want to complain about something else in National's tax package, because this is an obsession of mine, which is the transfer system, the very, very complex transfer system that Grant Robertson and Mclauchlan introduced back in 2005 with Working for Families, has left us with this device that politicians just find completely irresistible, which is that instead of offering tax breaks, because National's tax breaks are quite limited, you can devise these very, very clever, demographically targeted rebates or subsidies or transfers, which have no economic rationale whatsoever. They're for cohorts of voters that the parties want to buy. And the more of these transfers they put into the system, the greater the complexity is, and the more of these high effective marginal tax rates that Jordan were talking about slowly build up. So you can actually see in some of the Treasury data sets, there are people paying 110% marginal tax on an extra hour of income that they worked because they hit some combination of, abatement thresholds that no one ever planned for, but are there because of the increasing complexity of the system. I'm not sure.
I'm going to give you a membership of the taxpayers unit at the end of this. Let's step back, though. What's driving this? It's this fear that rich foreigners are driving up our costs of housing, which simply, it's report after report after report shows it's not a demand-side problem. But I'd ask a slightly different question, is how do we get New Zealand to a situation where we are the rich ones, rather than fearing countries and foreigners that are richer than us?
All right. Another question that's come from the audience. How do you tax unrealised capital gain? If and should you do it at all? And I'll throw that to you first, Max.
No, you don't and you shouldn't. And I suspect this is coming from a little point of maybe confusion about policy versus research. The Parker Inland Revenue Report looked at unrealised capital gains because that's what you have to do when you've only got a 6-year period and you've only got access to certain data. That is research. That has very little to do with policy. If you were designing a capital gains tax, which, by the way, essentially every other developed country except us has, it would be a tax on realised capital gains, which, as all those other developed countries have found, is reasonably straightforward to do.
All right, so that's a dumb idea.
I was at the lockup and then the question period afterwards. I was still hobbling around a bit because I was still on crutches. I remember it distinctly. I'd asked Minister Parker the question on that because everything in there was unrealized gains. So I'd asked him whether they were planning on taxing unrealized gains because, well, that's a big component of what he was looking at. And he didn't say that they were, but not as a, I'm not going to do it, more as a, we're not making any policy announcements at this time kind of thing. It looked pretty obvious to me that he was wanting a tax on unrealized gains. And man, that'd be impossible to try and work. You'd need to have a valuation date, then continuing ongoing valuation of really complicated matters. If you've got privately held companies that don't trade on the share market, their valuation is really hard to figure out. It'd be a nightmare that you certainly wouldn't want to buy.
All right, Daniel?
But I guess he must have been thinking about the wealth tax, which is kind of a way of getting unrealized gains, isn't it?
Well, a wealth tax would be taxing paper gains,
Yeah.
right?
Yep. So
you've got all of that.
So that's how you do it.
Yeah.
Okay, so
I mean,
also unrealised capital gains, you say no tax on that? Unworkable?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure. But yeah, I think it's unworkable, but that's why they were deciding to go for the wealth tax.
Okay.
But it's the same problem.
These guys are a lot more moderate than what at least two senior ministers in Labor don't just want, they were working on until Hipkins pulled the plug, and what the Greens are going into and saying for them it's a sit on the crossbench issue.
And again, I would say that they're looking at the wealth tax because the capital gains tax has this high political cost. And I would say remove that high political cost or you're going to end up with the wealth tax.
Can I just add briefly to that? There was a really big OECD report on wealth taxes that came out in 2018 and looked at practice all around the world and taxation of high incomes. And what they basically, the conclusion of that report is your ideal system has a comprehensive tax on capital gains and on inheritances because they're all forms of income. And Eric made the point earlier that basic principle of fairness is that people in equivalent circumstances are treated equally. And of course the massive unfairness in the New Zealand tax system at the moment is that income from salaries and wages is taxed and the same amount of income from capital gains isn't. So the OECD view is ideal scenario, comprehensive capital gains tax and inheritance taxes. But it said if your country doesn't have either of those, then a perfectly reasonable backstop is a net wealth tax, a wealth tax of the kind that, say, Switzerland has, which brings in about 1% of revenue every year, 1% of GDP every year, so in New Zealand that'd be about $3.5 billion. It's not a first best solution, but if you don't have any of the other taxes, you can go there as a second best.
Okay. I think the same report showed that there had been something like a dozen or 15 countries that had imposed wealth taxes, and that dropped to about 4 over the prior decade. So there's a reason people have been going away from these things. They don't work very well.
The only reason that they ditched them, as it said in that report, is because they'd been so riddled full of exemptions that they weren't raising a huge amount of revenue. But that's not a historical, that's not an inevitable though, that's a design thing. So you can just, if you decide to have your wealth tax and you don't riddle it full of exemptions, like the Swiss obviously don't, then it works perfectly fine.
Okay, look, I don't want you to get into too much detail here, but someone's asked, proposed an interesting question that I want to throw at both teams and you guys work out how you answer it. I'll go to you guys first. What does your ideal tax system for New Zealand look like, guys?
Oh, wow. I'm never allowed to dream like that. I'm always constrained to, okay, well, what seems possible? And oh my God, they're proposing things that are going to wreck something that's basically decent. All right. I don't think it's nuts to have a shift towards taxing land as compared to income. I think that you have fewer risks of capital flight land is obviously immovable. I would prefer that you not get the capital gains in land in the first place. My concern on that remains that council tax base is on land and the valuation of capital on it. I would prefer to have councils be restricted to land alone, the unimproved value of it, rather than land plus capital, and then let councils pick up a bit more so that we'd have overall more reliance on land taxes as compared to central government's remit. As for the rest, I would prefer to get a bit closer to the tax system that we would have had. 2015 wasn't too bad. Getting rid of the 39% rate. Yeah, keeping the clean GST.
Okay, Max, what does your guys' perfect tax system look like?
Well, I mean, I don't think you ever design a tax system in the abstract. You have to think about, I mean, what's the point of all of it? What are we trying to achieve with it? And having been fortunate enough to see, some of the public services in mainland Europe and the UK, they have a tax take that's, about a third bigger than ours often. So their governments have another $20 to $30 billion a year to spend on public services than we do, if you assume the same New Zealand economy at the same size. And so I would like to have that money to put into really high quality public services for New Zealanders. I would get there with, as I said, capital gains taxes and inheritance taxes. That'd get you part of the way. The other things that countries with really high class public services do is they have more social security taxes. So flat rate taxes on payroll of wage and salary earners with employer contributions as well. And typically that funds things like healthcare that's free at the point of use. And so the trade-off people make is they pay a little bit more tax, but they get really fantastic, high quality, world-class public services, and that would be my dream system.
Actually, I just want to raise that point because I think that's interesting, and Daniel, I'd be interested in your response to this. That idea of people knowing where their tax goes and what proportion of it's going on what and coming back to them, I think is incredibly appealing to the general public.
Didn't someone propose a tax receipt? I can't remember who that was.
Bill English.
Who was it?
Bill English brought that up as a possibility, yeah.
Okay.
The problem is it only looks at what the spending is rather than the value for money. If you might think, I'm getting a great deal, the government's spending $500 for me to go to the GP. But the question is that if under that, should it be $500?
Yeah.
Sean, can I address it's a dream come true, likewise. In the time I had to think about it, number one, indexing income tax thresholds. That's one of the big reasons why government spending is out of control, because we're all paying a higher average tax rate as we all come up into higher tax brackets. We're on the average income earner is now paying the rich prick tax only a government or two ago.
And land tax, we have a narrow tax base instead of a broad tax base like every other OECD country.
A well-kept secret that the political opponents could use against us is the Taxpayers Union has endorsed previously a land tax. Again, you can't move it. Difficult in New Zealand because of Maori land holdings, but still should be considered. The rocket under the Trump administration, and I don't find myself referring to that very often, but was full expensing of capital investments from the business. You want less money going into housing, more money going to productive assets? Full capital expensing is the way to go there. I would actually abolish company tax, which people would go, what? That would mean companies aren't paying anything. But of course, because we have imputation credits, if you own a company, you're not. It simply is a timing issue. So I would replace that, get rid of all the tax accountants from companies, and simply do it as a foreign shareholding withholding tax. And in terms of quality of expenditure, I would require KiwiSaver, rather than taxing for these specific things, KiwiSaver style savings accounts for health and similar, again, to improve that quality of spending.
I guess I'd just jump back in with one last week. I'd gone first, so I didn't have much time to think about it. One of the things that's just really been pissing me off over the election period is we used to have this thing called the generally agreed tax policy process, where if government wanted to change tax, they had this really long process where they consulted with experts, with people in industry who'd be affected, and just figured out, okay, how badly are we going to screw something up inadvertently if we go ahead with this? And they'd work all of that out before they tried pitching something. And now every other week we're getting some proposal of, okay, well, we're going to abolish depreciation in this area and reinstate it in this other area. And none of it has to do with sound tax policy principles. It's all about filling holes in their other policy platforms.
But that's because, IRD used to be the adults in the room. IRD used to be the reliable, steady hand. Now, unfortunately, we've joined so many other countries in having a politicised revenue agency.
So I would encourage whatever system you put in, just get the process back to that generally agreed tax policy process instead of dicking around with
Daniel,
it.
did you have, because you didn't get much of a chance on your perfect tax system.
I don't spend a lot of time gazing at the stars and thinking about tax, but I have often thought that Australia seems pretty good. They have the tax-free threshold and then kind of like gradually increasing progressive tax and then capital gains on that. So, at the high end you see very, very high tax rates because they just put the capital gains.
We've got to get to summing up soon, but I want to have a very, very simple question. It's pretty well yes or no. It's binary. Does anyone on this panel on either side of me believe that either of the major parties or anyone likely to occupy the Treasury benches post the 14th of next month is going to make our tax system fundamentally better than it is now? Where's the enthusiasm, people?
We might get indexation if the Nats still stand by that, but they seem to flip-flop every other month.
Okay.
And what they promised on it was every 3 years it'd be a political reassessment. If they were taking it seriously, it'd be a directive to IRD saying whenever accumulated fiscal drag rounds to a round number, you do it.
So you're about the numbers. You say they're not going to get much better. You guys are all about the fairness. Do you look at what's proposed by the other side who might get there, or, the centre right? Is there anything that's got you excited?
I think about Labour's top rate of 39%, which they introduced, and which has brought in over $800 million in the first year, but which only applies to the top 2%, I think, of taxpayers. And so their commitment to not alarming anyone in Middle New Zealand is just quite extraordinary. I mean, sort of almost like performance art. And I think that is going to continue, and look, the Greens can ask, if they got into a coalition with Labour, which doesn't look super likely, they can ask for a wealth tax all they like, but given that Chris Hipkins has ruled it out and explicitly said it won't happen, and if he turns tail on that, you could never believe any promise that Labour ever made ever again. Some people would already say you can't, but park that thought for the moment. And I think probably Labour would be out of power for a generation if it did that. So I can't see any huge changes coming from a Labour Greens Te Pāti Māori government.
All right.
So one of the reasons we have this indexation, the bracket creep that the negative team, are they the negative team?
Well, I'm not too sure who's what,
we keep
to be
thinking
honest,
you're on our
after
team,
the last half hour.
It's because we have a narrow tax system, and it's irresistible for finance ministers to just keep gradually getting higher and higher taxes from income tax without having to change any laws. Inflation just does it for them.
So you see nothing, whatever the outcome of the election, that's really going to solve or lead to the change you want?
Because we've deliberately distorted our tax system and we don't have the other revenue sources, if you're a finance minister, that's such a great deal. A tax increase every year without any, invisibly, quietly, that they find it hard to say no to that, don't they?
All right. The same deal for them, though, even if they had other taxes, though, right?
Yeah. I think agreement is in danger of breaking out. So let's try and stop that, because it's not good for business when you're a journalist. It really isn't. You've got to have people sort of hating on each other, or at least losing their rag. It is now time for closing remarks. Everyone's going to get 5 minutes each to close. And we are going to start in reverse order of what everyone's spoken. I won't forget him this time. Jordan Williams, 5 minutes, off you go.
To win tonight, our opponents needed to convince you not that someone, the property-owning rich person who's paid off their mortgage over their lifetime and is now sitting on an unproductive asset, they don't need to convince you that they need to pay more. They need to convince you that the government deserves more. And I put to you, in fact, it was acknowledged by the other side that the quality of government spending is very poor. But they also needed to establish that by putting these, in fact, it was a climb down. We were expecting a wealth tax. Instead, it's now a CGT. We brought them back a little. But they need to convince us that by increasing the taxes on the very thing that's movable, the very thing New Zealand needs, capital, savings, investment, that they will not strangle the goose that lays the golden egg. Friends, in my lifetime, the two problems have been, number one, New Zealand's poor labour productivity caused by undercapitalisation and a lack of savings investment. The other problem has been, as my friends on the opposing team have pointed out, too much money in housing. This is the very things that every proposal for a wealth tax or a capital gains tax has excluded. The family home. Only in political focus groups could you end up with a solution that would make the very problem you're trying to fix even worse. And it is for these reasons that they win on the tax system's unfair. We all think that. But friends, taxing the wealthy, those that are able to move away easily, simply because we feel that they deserve to pay more in a situation where our government doesn't deserve another cent and it makes us poorer, must surely fail.
Thank you, Jordan. And you got a concession already. No, the tax system is unfair from these guys. Daniel,
So
your rebuttal or your final remarks, closing remarks.
I don't want to talk about waste because, that's the argument, right? That there's waste in government, the quality of spending is low, cut that spending, and you don't need to raise tax on the rich. In fact, you can reduce tax to everybody. That's the logic here, right? And I often find myself thinking about the 2019 wellbeing budget. I don't know if everyone remembers that. And my understanding from reading the coverage in The Guardian is that Jacinda Ardern, for the very first time in history, invested money in wealth and health and welfare. And that turned us into a beacon for the world. And $1.1 million of that went to Aranga Tamariki, the Ministry for Vulnerable Children. And to me, that is just kind of the ideal place for my tax money to go, right? You have these children that have been damaged, that have been abused and neglected by society, and the state is going to wrap around them, and it's going to support them, and it's going to help them live out the rest of their lives. Unfortunately, a Treasury report in 2022 looked into where that money went and found that they didn't really know. The processes in the organisation were so poor they couldn't really track the spending. But what they did find is that the cost of every child that the organisation supported went up, but the outcomes did not improve. And that's kind of a bit of an epitaph for this government. We spent all this money, we didn't really get anything. And that makes me so angry. I find it so frustrating. And it's partly because it's my money, but it's also because there's an opportunity cost there to sort of do something really profound with the state that has been failed. And if you're a little bit kind of cold-hearted and maybe you don't care about them, and I kind of get that vibe from segments of the audience, you can look at it through Bill English's social investment framework, and you can see that each of these children is going to live out a life that is going to have a massive fiscal cost to the state, the welfare system, the criminal justice system, and the health system. So there is both kind of a left-wing and a right-wing case, I think, for actually having competent government services that are funded by tax revenue that deliver better outcomes. But maybe you're kind of a libertarian. Do we have any libertarians in the audience? Yeah, okay. And so government just can't do that if you're a libertarian. Government is never the solution. Government is always the problem, right? So, there are lots of states that have effective welfare systems, but let's just pretend that there aren't for a second. So you take all that away because it's just waste, right? And you're just going to kind of have markets, and maybe all these sort of very, very damaged people with violent backgrounds are going to become kind of rational agents making sensible decisions in a market with perfect information. But there's still going to be some kind of state. Even if it's a minimal Hayekian state, there is still going to be a government. You're still going to have a tax system. I suspect you're going to need a lot of police and a lot of prisons, and that's going to cost you a lot. So there will still be tax. And so even if you reduce the tax take, get rid of all the waste, you're still confronted with this question, of who is paying tax and who is not, and what is being taxed and what is not. And so you're in this imaginary society in which the market is going to solve all your problems. And if you have this distorted tax system, you're immediately breaking the market. So, you're kind of destroying the one thing that you think is going to deliver the outcomes that the state was delivering for you. So for the last 30 years, international agencies like the IMF and the OECD have been screaming at New Zealand to fix our tax system because the way we have set it up is just so inane. There's no fiscal argument for keeping the current settings. There's no argument for waste. Why don't we stop having a wasteful government? Instead, we kind of hear these arguments about we shouldn't fix it because that's the politics of envy. And I am actually filled with envy. And the envy I feel is for the states that actually have, competent governments, left-wing political parties that can use the states to deliver services, and that have kind of right-wing parties that actually believe in free markets and competition instead of cartels and stagnation and decline. Thank you. So don't forget to vote.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, you've encouraged everyone completely. Eric, away you go. 2.5 minutes.
Well, at risk of furthering violent agreement, Daniel's made much of the argument that I would have made, but I think that it works to our side, right? That the moot that we were presented with is that the tax system is unfair and the wealthy should pay more. Now, that wasn't an argument about changing the proportion of tax to the wealthy. Is that the wealthy should... We've been arguing that if you keep giving money to a government that's as irresponsible as Daniel has conceded and that we've contended, it's just encouraging further messes. Overall tax take should go down, and once government's got its act in order where we can trust that an additional dollar taken in tax will be put to useful purpose, demonstrating value, then we can talk about where we could raise more money. And I think it'd be a lot less fraught, right? Because if everybody can see that there is obvious good being done with the next dollar being collected, that's a much easier case to make than we've got right now. That's not the world we're in. Unfortunately, a lot of the real injustices that Daniel and others have talked about, they're not really fixed by the tax system. We've mentioned the absence of a capital gains tax and the problems in housing. That's still fundamentally a supply issue. If you fix that at source by addressing supply, you just wouldn't get the same kind of capital gains in housing anymore, and you'd have a more reasonable housing market. Everything seems to keep coming down to land. In Daniel's prior argument, you could imagine as part of a reduction in the overall tax burden, some kind of a shift towards having a greater emphasis on land. Because one of the neat tricks is that if you're talking about just soaking the rich, well, they've got a lot of financial assets. And the thing with financial assets is they're real easy to move overseas. It'd be ridiculously simple for somebody who is actually wealthy to leave New Zealand, move to Australia or somewhere else, pay income tax somewhere else, and not face a wealth tax, if we were talking about a wealth tax, which was the initial moot that we've been talking about. So land, on the other hand, doesn't move. For the wealthy, it's primarily financial assets, and those are highly mobile. Daniel had a prior argument also, I'm kind of mixing a bit in rebuttal and in conclusion, but it's a worry that I've got, right? So Daniel's talked about the problems in concentration of wealth, and that contributes to political power, and that might give people, like, if you happen to be the horse racing industry, you might be able to buy a whole political party out of being the horse racing industry.
Completely hypothetically.
Purely hypothetically. For sake of example, in some other country that's less corrupt or more corrupt. Anyways, somewhere else. But there's a flip side to it too, right? The greater the pot of money that the government controls, the greater the returns from rent seeking. If you've got a small state, what are you arguing for when you're going to beg government for stuff? They don't have stuff, right? Instead, we've had now the government set a fund of money to try and subsidize companies to make investments in decarbonization that they've already got strong incentive to do. And they wouldn't be begging for the money if the pot of money wasn't there. They'd just be making the investments on their own. Instead, we've set up a rent-seeking society, and Daniel's talked about that. The way to limit the rent-seeking society is to limit the rents and to limit the pool of money that the government has available. I think that we have taken the moot, that we have agreed that government is spectacularly ineffective. We can't see any value in additional money going to it. Whether you want to have the wealthy bearing a greater share of a smaller tax take, well, that's up for grabs, but we shouldn't have the wealthy paying more or anyone else.
All right. Now, just a reminder, at the end of this, you re-vote, or in the process if you've already made up your mind, and we will judge the winner not on pure majority, but on how many people were changed in their minds in the course of the debate. Okay, that's the way that the Free Speech Union do it. So it's how many people you have convinced. Max, it falls to you to wrap it all up.
I wanted to start my closing remarks with a quotation, which is that the foundation of economic prosperity is government. And this alarmingly socialist quote comes from none other than the National Party. Admittedly, the National Party of the 1950s, and its Finance Minister J.T. Watts, who some of you may or may not remember. But that was a time when the National Party had perhaps a more positive view about the power of state spending, and one which I would argue is still, at least to some extent, justified. You look at the government's increased spending on welfare benefits, allowing people to live a life of greater dignity. The proportion of children who say they live in households where they regularly run out of food has fallen from 20% in 2018 to 12% in the last couple of years. So real successes, real changes in people's lives. The Healthy Homes Initiative that I mentioned, finding curtains and insulation and other things for poorer households. Just 1 year of the returns from that program is greater than the 8-year cost of operating it. The Warm Up New Zealand housing insulation programs return $5 in benefits for every dollar spent. There is huge potential in public spending to improve outcomes for everyone, and I think we should focus on those things which do the most good rather than constantly asserting that all this money is badly spent. The opposition has painted, again, quite a dystopian picture of what would happen with people leaving the country if we tried to tax them. But the problem is more, if you think about the converse. Well-off people in New Zealand, people on 5 times the average wage, as I said, pay 13% of their income, according to the OECD, in tax, 30% in Australia. So New Zealand, far, far lower taxes than other places. Surely then we should have had a massive influx of capital and entrepreneurship and all these kinds of things. And yet, strangely, we haven't.
Can I just interrupt you? You guys absolutely dispute that figure.
Well, hang on. I've got my 5 minutes here. I'll keep going if I may. So this is OED stuff. So I mean, and it's not in dispute that New Zealand doesn't have capital gains taxes, doesn't have inheritance taxes, doesn't have wealth taxes, and we haven't seen a huge inflow of people here. And indeed, you also don't see outflows necessarily in huge amounts from countries where there are higher taxes. I mean, Germany, Austria, the Netherlands, have they suddenly been abandoned by all their wealthy people? I don't think so. There's huge numbers of entrepreneurs there. When you look at US states, which are a great natural experiment because some of them levy their own state income taxes, you don't see outflows from US states that have higher state tax rates. And if you think about what would these well-off New Zealanders do if we tried to tax them more in New Zealand? Where would they go? Would they go to Australia, where they'd pay a capital gains tax? Would they go to the UK, where they'd pay an inheritance tax? Would they go to the US, where they'd pay capital gains tax and an inheritance tax? I don't think so. I think the truth is that, just like everyone else, better off people often seek out countries where talent wants to live, in the words of the late lamented Paul Callaghan. And the places where talent wants to live are places where there is a highly skilled, highly educated workforce, where there is a healthy population able to get the treatment that it needs, where the air is clean, the workplaces are safe, and the rule of law applies. And all these things, education, healthcare, justice, are things that are substantially delivered by the state through taxation. And the state also funds the things, the roads, the railways, the blue skies research, the power, the infrastructure, all the things that the economy relies on. And in those countries where they get a greater tax contribution from their wealthiest citizens, those people are very often happy to pay that tax. They recognise that even if they have become wealthy partly through their own efforts, they have done so while driving on roads that are publicly funded, using health and education systems provided by the state, and carrying out their business via government-funded ultra-fast broadband. They have, in short, drawn deeply from the pool of collective public services provided through tax, and it's only appropriate they recognise that they make a generous contribution towards replenishing that pool. Of course, everyone draws from that pool, but we can't ask more for people who are struggling to pay the bills. And so I don't think it's fair that we have a system where the wealthiest New Zealanders pay a lower rate of tax than people stacking shelves in supermarkets. I think it would be fairer if we asked for a greater contribution to replenishing our collective pool of resources from those who can most afford it. Thank you very much.
Now, I'm not sure of the delivery mechanism on the votes. I take it you guys are working away at it and you'll have it for us soon. I do want to make the following observations. And can we have another round of applause collectively for our four debaters, please? I think we all appreciate the spirit you debated in. And I want to propose, I've been trying to think of a moot that you'd all agree with. Because there are times at night, tonight where, honestly, it was hard to tell, you could have been swapping sides. And
except for the point where I argued for the tax stake to increase by about 30%.
Yeah.
I feel like that was still, a dividing line.
But let's find a mood. Let's look for some kindness, some caring, some sharing. What about this? The tax system is unfair. You guys admitted that, right? So we can all agree the tax system is unfair. We got that. And unproductive wealth, let's not personalise it, unproductive wealth must pay more.
No.
You get that?
Yeah.
And you agree?
What gets defined as unproductive,
yeah.
right? People usually say that about housing, but housing is productive in housing services, right? The problem is regulations that mean you can't build more housing.
Well, okay, so you wouldn't
Why
agree.
don't we just stick with the veggies?
Okay. Also, look, I was amazed tonight you all agree that there is nothing sending you rigid in common parlance about either major party's tax policies. There are issues. You all have issues with, I guess, the parties or the parts of the political spectrum that one would traditionally identify with you. And Daniel, you've got problems with your wife in your house that we're just going to leave.
A topic for another debate.
It's your own personal hell that you go through. I also think it's proof, and this is a fundamental issue, and I started my reporting career just as Roger Douglas became the Minister of Finance, and I witnessed an awful lot of change in the New Zealand economy, some of it very painful for a lot of people. And I think the incrementalism and the kind of political populism that seems to be driving all parts of the political spectrum at the moment has not been constructive in getting smart people like you together to figure out how we do better. And it would be my hope that as a country we are better, less polarised and better at coming together on these issues so we do not get some of the bad ideas that you have all agreed about this evening. Thank you very much indeed for your time. And we have through the wonders of modern technology, and I have to announce, but what was the margin? Big or small? Tiny. By a tiny margin, the winners, those who have convinced more people to their point of view, and that is the negative of the moot, that the tax system is not unfair and the wealthy shouldn't pay more tax, the winners are Eric and Jordan. Congratulations.
Thank you.
And is that it? I now say goodbye to those listening on the platform because it was simulcast. Do listen to me tomorrow morning at 7 o'clock, and everyone else has been following. Thank you for being such a great audience. Cheers.